these new ways of seeing we're trying to speak about are at the very same time ancient ways of being that are being rediscovered. We're only speaking about something in new language from a perspective of a culture that has lived separation to the point of believing it, and has created technologies that, as Arthur C. Clarke, I think, said, are indistinguishable from magic. And so on that journey personally, I think now that I'm a father of a 5-year-old, I'm being reminded that the knowing is there from the start, but it's undifferentiated. It's simply participatory, and that is a very different way of being in the world than once we even start with the powerful technology of being taught words, and with that, categories of the world. And I think I quite early on felt a little bit ill at ease with my culture, coming from Germany, understanding like in the decades that I grew up, education about the German history was like re-education of a people to a point that it was like really sticking young faces into a past that wasn't really theirs, but of course in a kind of intergenerational trauma and responsibility was theirs. And so I think that made me reflect quite early on, and also the luck that a sports teacher realized that I wasn't that good in all the kind of competitive ball-based games, and invited me into yoga when I was 11 as an alternative at the school that I was going to. And that very early on introduced me to the Tao Te Ching and the Bhagavad Gita and just some writing that made me question perspective. Along with living in Munich means in the middle of the Cold War, means understanding that we had cruise missiles and SS-20 pointing at us, and that we were part of the battlefield of World War III at that point in where we were talking about crisis. For some of us, we remember that. For others, it's in history books. But it was imminent. It was real. It was. I remember sitting with my 3.5-year-old brother on the roof of our house, looking towards, which was maybe 2 kilometers away, which was the kind of government communications headquarters in Großes Lohe in Munich. So we knew that one of the direct targets that were being targeted in this game of mutually assured destruction was 2 miles away from us. And so I'm getting all emotional remembering that. But yeah, we've been a threat to ourselves and to life on Earth for a long time. But where we started with the ancient ancestry of us, we need to remember that we wouldn't be here if we hadn't been regenerative, place-sourced cultures, cultures that understood themselves as guardians and expressions of the bioregions they inhabited. That's a different way of being in the world that is in its very nature holistic. And in many ways, our conversation about holism is in the power and the misunderstandings that language can produce. We eventually needed a way back to an understanding that before all that talk, we already had. And for me, that's what holism is trying to do. It's trying to remind us that this is a deeply participatory universe. So yeah, now I've come off topic from my story. Where did it start? And it's a double question, just briefly. It's like knowing how we know, and how that in and of itself is already part of the root causes of the crisis we're currently experiencing. And then knowing the crisis, like knowing how deep the messed up things have gotten at this point, and how 20 past 1, not 5 to 12, it actually is. That's another knowing that is still growing, deepening every day, and maturing me every day beyond taking permanence too serious.
Yes, we will come to the topic of hope or despair in one of the next episodes. And I see Marcus' hand raised. So Marcus, can I ask you to bring in whatever you want to say?
Yes, I wanted to acknowledge that you just helped me understand something about myself, Daniel, that I had not quite so consciously reflected upon, although I was very aware of the theme, and that is, I too grew up in Germany. I grew up near Dortmund and then lived in Heidelberg for a while as well before I moved to the UK in 2003. But this theme of the very conscious education into the past and the intergenerational split. My father, born just after the war, not getting any answers from his family, and the pressure that was on the education system in order to confront the next generation with the sins of the fathers was extraordinary, and a very fertile ground for my own development. So I appreciate the reflections you've given of it, and you've touched on a theme with that. You like you, I also recognize that others had a hand in my development early on. My recognition was not a PE teacher who allowed me to experience yoga, but I had an individual who gave me books. He recognized something and he gave me books of a particular thing that were well beyond my reading age. And it started something, a reflective process. And I'm very aware that in this kind of thing, there is despite our world of separation, for me, a theme of connectedness was set up through this recognition of elders who somehow didn't see themselves as elders, but they did a service unto me that was very much that, by giving me books that helped me become who I am today. It took me a long time to see it like that. Then you spoke about how these ways of seeing today are really ways of being of an ancient kind. And there is an aspect here with a very fine edge that I have a need to explore. I just wondered what your contribution to that might be, which is that it's very easy to dismiss Western culture and its approach to science and so forth as the reason for the difficulties we experience globally now, the meta crisis, which we will come to later. Especially its notion of progress. Any problem will always be sorted in the future. But through a writer called Peter Kingsley, you might be familiar with him. Yes, I discovered for myself that the problem of the West might lie much further back than we so readily assume. He puts his finger very firmly on Plato as the beginning of a disconnection, in Ian McGilchrist's words, sort of a focus on the left brain, advanced very much by Aristotle then, where we were cut off from our mystical past, where Plato did an enormous deed of essentially moving all our right brain, religious, interconnected experience of life. He moved it into, very skillfully rewrote history, as it were, didn't acknowledge his sources, created sources in order to place himself very favorably in a particular light, and that has lived since then in a way that we believed him, but we didn't see the damage he actually did. And so when Whitehead says all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato, that is for me the origin or the it's something that I've explored deeply, and I've been trying to look beyond Plato into the past in order to understand what might the mission of the West actually be. And could it be that this issue with Plato is actually part of what we need to redeem? This is a big interconnected rabbit warren, but I just wanted to offer that into this space, and we can skip it.
No. Let's stay there briefly, because with mentioning Whitehead, I mean, why would Whitehead say this? Because Whitehead was pointing towards process philosophy in one way of speaking. It's just, as you were sharing how important books have been in your life, of course, as you know, from, if you're familiar with my work, the same in my life, and I remember many mentors, who particularly Seton Baxter, who I did my PhD with, who were just genius in feeding me the right book at the right time in a way that just magically allowed me come up with new ideas that I would then excitedly tell him, and then after telling him in the evening, realizing, wait a minute, he planted the seeds. I only had that insight because of that conversation that I had with him 2 weeks ago. So I hear all that, but at the same time, I had this interesting email today from somebody who led the subject, so I would look at it with literate people learn words, illiterate people learn worlds. Boom. Boom. That's big. And like, to the point, to what we were going to talk about. So nothing is a coincidence. So this person writes to me today. And that addresses Plato's need to objectify the world in order to frame it in ways that can create structures of power over rather than power with, structures of separation rather than structures of interbeing in Thich Nhat Hanh's framing. And more than that, the word is the beginning of, like, this kind of work, philosophy, explaining the world through the intellect, through rational mind, through logic that is A is either A, or something is either A or it's B. It can never be A and B at the same time, like this exclusionary logic, this binary system that I love Ian McGilchrist's work, but I find the left hemisphere, right hemisphere thing is polarizing and difficult in and of itself. And if you actually understand neuroplasticity and brain science, you can see that the brain is entirely capable of switching areas that it's using to a certain degree in its own healing after accidents and so on. But anyway, that's me going into a rabbit hole. But what I'm trying to speak to is this, how important it is whether we see the world through a language that is focused on nouns and on objectifying versus seeing the world in a kind of more verb-based way. And as we're beginning to see the world that way, we're beginning to see ourselves that way. So we become more and more of an object, more and more of something separate from the world that is standing in the world, rather than a node of consciousness that, in the kind of Francisco Varela and Humberto Maturana's perspective, is actually bringing forth the world in the way of knowing, that the very act of the world knowing itself through us is the act of the first distinction that then brings forth what the Buddhists call samsara. And we might as well live with it, because you cannot take a perspective without creating a blind spot. But if we are aware of it and we honor the traps of it, and you also, like, because there was a lot in your question or comment, of course it's dangerous to vilify Western science or the Western perspective. And there are lots of examples of people in the Western, like, I mean, just read Richard Tarnas's wonderful book, The Passion of the Western Mind, where he actually takes you through how this story evolved in the West. And he also, towards the end, highlights the countercurrent, the Fichte, the Kants, the Hegels, the Goethes, to some extent Rudolf Steiners and so on. The other way of participatory knowing the world. So for me, that's, yeah, I'm agreeing with you that with Plato a lot of things started, but I wouldn't necessarily blame Plato for it. In the sense that I think all these steps are like, there's a wonderful book talking about the kind of intellectual anthroposophists. Owen Barfield wrote a book called Saving Appearances, Lessons in Ideology, or something like that. It's a small little book. And in it, if I'm remembering the title at the moment correctly, but in it he speaks of original participation, which is the participation of the indigenous, highly, everything is significant. I am part of this web of life, all my relations. The dewdrop that is hit by the sun as I walk past is not a coincidence, not a physical phenomenon that breaks light into a certain visual stimulus. No, it's meaningful. It communicates to me. It says something. That is one way of knowing the world through participation. But I think we needed the story of separation, the Enlightenment, in order to now come to what Owen Barfield calls final participation. And that's going to take us, like, I mean, because we left it so long, I think we're going to get a bit of a pasting that will humble us. But we might just find higher ground rather than go into some kind of end game, which is the other option, which wouldn't be so nice. And I think what we are all about is trying to find different ways of connecting people so we can find that higher ground. And at the moment, we're still using this technology, and may it be with us, but it's also comes with a big rat's tail, and it also takes us away from the physical communities each and every one of us are living in every day. And I'm living that in my body a lot at the moment, because it's taking me away from my child, from my relationship, from my neighbors and my community, to be in conversations with people all over the globe, which is magic. But I am realizing it's dangerous as well. And at the moment, I can't do very much more than name it and try to redesign my life in a way that I come back into balance with that. And sorry for a long answer to a not question.
One phrase that we might use in order to describe the situation we are now in is meta-crisis. Meta-crisis meaning that there is a large number of individual crises that are occurring in parallel, and we recognize that we cannot solve them at the level we created them, which almost feels trivial to say it like that now. We have to, there is something that connects all of these crises, and that ultimately is summarized maybe in the way we think needs to rise to the challenge. So we lump them all together, we call it a meta crisis, and we address the shift in thinking. And then you quite nicely, just in the last answer, talked about the differentiation of your view of regeneration from the view of Carol Sanford and Regenesis, Pamela Mang, and so forth. And if I understand correctly, so here's my first question, you're saying that there is a certain idealistic assumption in the work of Carol Sanford, where a system has a certain state of health that we need to that we can get back into, as opposed to seeing the system itself as part of in development. Have I summarized that correctly?
Mm-hmm. No, I don't think they would feel fairly represented. Their understanding of what health is about is that health is this falling back into a perfect state, and rather than understanding health as dynamic, evolutionary, and regenerative. But everything else they do, even and like to finish your question with regard to the meta crisis, but even like they have a very powerful response to this crisis problem based approach. But yeah, please continue your question.
So I'm very interested in their work and also in yours. And for me, there's a tension between the two that I haven't yet managed to resolve for myself entirely. So I feel that whenever I get into a situation like that there has to be another level of integration that allows the duality to exist, if that makes any sense. But speaking of many different aspects, what for you are the hallmarks of the meta crisis we live through at the moment? So I said it's a crisis of thinking. How would you describe it?
Well, I mean, people have all sorts of. We have a water, energy, and climate crisis problem in the framing of a lot of people. We have lots of well-meaning people working really hard day in, day out to race to zero carbon, seeing the world through a carbon myopic climate change response. And they're all good people and they all mean well. And then we have one COP where we have 50,000 people descend on Egypt to talk about the climate, which is bizarre. And then a few days later, we have another COP to talk about nature-based services and like quantifying and monetizing nature so we can save it. What happens there is that a approach to crisis or problem, to situation, plays out. And that's what I learned through Kara Sanford and through Regenesis Group, and why I so deeply am in debt to their 25 years of regenerative practice in all I do. I don't really disagree with them on most things, many things, but that issue about health is a specific one that we simply don't seem to be able to evolve together, which I've been trying for a long time. But what I've learned from them, that Kara Sanford points out so clearly, is we have all been trained through education to look at the world through problems, that we then have disciplines and the might of experts in disciplines take perspectives on the problem. And then we bring them all together in large conferences. And once they've defined the problem in the abstract from 15 different disciplines in all detail and shown how it shows up in every place on the planet, so it's a globalizable problem that we all need to deal with, then we bring in the financiers who say, yes, let's do a little competition with the designers and the technologists and find solutions to this problem. For like, let's bring them all together for 5 days and do a hackathon or a sandbox or a design sprint or whatever you want to name it. And then the best 10 get our funding to do a startup, and we launch it, and then we have the solution, and then we bring more funding in, and then we force it on everybody in the planet because it's the solution. And that's the pathway that happens when you take everything through problem, abstraction of problem, find solution, and then bring the solution back to the specific. What Kara Sanford and Regenesis have been about in all their work is to remind people and to bring the dialogue to the group of people they're working with to say, okay, well, that is all a bit abstract and it doesn't make sense to me. Can we go into the specific? Where do you live? Who do you talk to? Who's against it? Who's for it? What have they had for breakfast and where did it come from? Like, in the sense of what is the specific of the place that you're trying to have agency in and that you're actually capable of having agency in because you are in that place. And then suddenly you have two ways of reducing complexity here. Either you look at it as abstract problems, or you reduce complexity so you can respond to it to the level through specificity. Suddenly, hunger, energy crisis, food crisis, brittle supply chains, pandemic response, all shows up in every single place, but it shows up differently in a different ecosystem, in a different culture with a different history in response to all these things and so on. And what they're saying is, if we want to have a snowball's chance in hell to respond to the polycrisis, let's not think of it as a polycrisis. Let's come home to place. Let's understand that if we all, in a cosmopolitan bioregionalism, full awareness that everybody needs to do this in their place, and that it's not about, we Western privileged people can afford to do this here, and let's forget about Africa and the other people, they better sort out their region and then we'll all be fine. We need to address past colonialism problems and economic injustice and help people everywhere to start the process of meeting what you call the polycrisis in place. And you, I mean, you named the worldview bit, which is interesting, because when you actually sit in place, and in my book I call it living the questions together, you don't look at the solutions. It's not about solutions. Of course you need them, and somebody needs to propose them, and you need to experiment with them, but at a scale where the feedback from the impact of those solutions is quick enough that we can course correct them or actually abandon them. And if we don't look at them as final products, but understand every solution as a stepping stone in learning, and we live the question continuously whether our past solutions are still fit for today, then we look at the fact that we can't avoid but live in the world that our ancestors or our predecessors designed for us. And we either accept that world or we transform it. And some of it is worth transforming, and some of it is worth accepting. And some of it is worth recovering, because we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater more than once in human history. And I could go on forever, but I don't want to have these endless monologues, sorry.
It's fascinating to hear you explain the background to your thinking a little more. I want to take this conversation about health and move it into the particular space of our relationship with nature. I am involved very much with agriculture. For me, one of the arenas in which the tragedy of being human plays out is the engagement with nature, but through the production of food and what we think about that. And there's a lot to the approach that I've developed, but one aspect that is very central to it is that we work with Alan Savory's holistic management approach, where context is everything. Context is, so every problem, as you say, is first and foremost a question of the holistic context, and the holistic context always requires that I bring myself to it. I will not find a solution unless I have an outcome in mind. And this is part of my approach to regeneration, is that regeneration is ultimately tied to outcomes. We cannot have a standard operating procedure that pursues an abstract goal. We have to have something that we are pursuing in the field, underneath our feet, with the people that are part of the local community. But it still begs the question, what actually is a healthy relationship with nature? And that question deliberately sets up nature as separate to humans, because that's one of the core dualities we've got at the moment. So I'm wondering, what do you personally see as a healthy relationship to nature?
The thing is that you always mention so many interesting things to hook into, so I will get there eventually, but just briefly, I mean, of course, agriculture, I think, has a lot to do with the place where we started to create the conditions through the technology of the plow that allowed us to be sedentary and therefore begin a different relationship with resources that ultimately led to construct sort of power over type situations. And so in many ways, like if you look at Cook arriving in Australia and saying the Aborigines didn't practice agriculture, they actually practiced an agriculture system so far advanced that it was indistinguishable from what Cook thought was just the wild forest. And they did so over vast distances divided into 8 seasons, where they knew when to be where and disturb how, in order to make that place more abundant. And you'll recognize this from how holistic land management works in terms of disturbing and rotational grazing and all those kind of practices. They mimic the natural regeneration process that is both in all of the larger transforming whole that we are part of, where we're not separate from what we call nature, but we're fundamentally participants in it, emergent properties of it. And so outcomes, yes, but I always liked, in a conversation with Bill Reed, the regenesis approach to working with people in place, in context, on a specific project that does get executed and does get built or co-created, is to, at all the steps of the way, be aware that the process, coming back to Whitehead and participatory knowing, the process by which we co-create these outcomes creates the most important outcome, which is capacity. The capacity of people in place to do it again, or to tweak it, or to transform it when it needs transforming. If the outcome is delivering what the design brief asked you to deliver, and give them the key and say, here, and call us, or here's a maintenance contract for the next 10 years, that's a solution. That's not the solution that is a prototype that has been co-developed with the people to say, you've learned a lot on this. We learned a lot of this. Like we've actually ended up implementing something completely else than we started doing when we first started talking to each other. And I think you'll recognize this also from holistic land management, that you need that flexibility in the system, and that ultimately the outcome is learning to learn the questions together even better, is continuous awareness of how our participatory, unavoidable interference with a place is either degenerative or regenerative, and we need to pay attention to this. And now you might want to repeat the final question you got to, because I think I took a detour.
No, so one individual that helped me open this space that you've gone into a little bit more is Ethan Soloviev, another a Carol Sanford student, or master pupil, whatever you want to call him. He says that we are going to struggle if we define regeneration, because we're going to only be able to do that now with the knowledge, language, etc., as we stand here. So rather, we need to understand it as a continuum, and open ourselves up to the ever greater seeing, ever greater understanding of what regeneration might mean. So it is an evolutionary process.
Absolutely, Ethan is so spot on with this, particularly with regard to this, because the current rapid take-up of the meme regenerative everywhere means that the usual suspects run the usual program in the usual way, with a new adjective in front. And they're not meaning badly, but they're professionals. They're trying to feed their families. They're doing what they always done. They just close the file on lean and on integral and on smart, and they open the file that says regenerative, and they dump lots of stuff in. I don't want to know how many of my Medium blogs are in there, and they don't read them, unfortunately.
Beautiful.
But the issue is that we now will, and this is where, again, dancing with Carol, and like, I hope I get to speak to Carol, because we've never spoken. Can you believe it? It's bizarre. But I have spoken a lot with Pamela and Ben and Bill and all these people. We can either say you don't get it. If you're trying to create a regenerative agriculture certification scheme, you've already lost the plot and you're not being regenerative anymore. And they're absolutely right, yes. And there's a skillful means that says, don't hit them in the head and say, you bad student, Zen stick, boom. Say, okay, if you hold your certification screen lightly enough, we can learn something from it. But the danger, of course, is the minute it then just gets put into business as usual and invested into it, then it actually becomes a corset and it avoids exactly what Ethan was pointing to, the ability of the system to be meaningful in context and break the rules, because the rules are written by the place and not by us. And the rules emerge in the dynamic relationship between climate, us, the place, water availability, people moving in and out, you name it. It's a complex, dynamic, fundamentally uncontrollable and unpredictable system. The best thing we can do is aim for appropriate participation. That's what I learned in the Masters in Holistic Science from Brian Goodwin. And it's different from the kind of holistic notion of building the perfect whole, like which permaculture sometimes likes to do. It's participatory. It's paying attention to the whole role that we have in it. And I love Ethan's work, and I think regenerative agriculture will somehow play out this field of how do we keep people engaged. And we, for example, you can run a classic questionnaire on, is your farm regenerative? And it is a living the questions. But if you do it just as an exercise to put another label on your produce, then you've missed the plot. But if you use it as a, whoa, that's a whole different way of doing agriculture. Okay, we'll plant trees. Okay, let's plant trees. And like agroforestry, all these different tools, like the toolbox is growing every day, particularly as we're acknowledging that we're not the pioneers. We're the quick learners who finally realized that the pioneers have been among us all the time, and we had the arrogance to call them primitive cultures. I mean, that's as embarrassing as it got. And in seeing that, we see that some of these cultures have developed beautiful place-based adaptations, like growing underground in sunken greenhouses in dry conditions. Is something that I want to try out in the food forest I just planted here, because I'm kind of 280 kilometers from the north coast of Africa. It's going to get hot. Anyway.
But the notion that I found very helpful here is to see, let thy food be thy medicine. But as I explored that more, I recognized so much that we try in our life to break things down into, say, moments or little packages, like the food somehow transports health, right? I imbibe health and then I'm healthy. But what I recognized is that actually this whole thing is not just the doing, and it's not just the being. It's, as Claudius in the introduction was pointing to, there's actually a co-evolution going on of the world that I am looking at and the world that is looking at me. We are becoming together in the process, and I have active agency in that. Not a special kind of agency, just a relevant kind of agency. I am relevant to the system, and I can influence it, and it influences me. So I'm in danger of going off piece, having said that I was going to bring it all back. But the important point for me was that food is just another angle. Agriculture is just another angle on the particular problem of a regenerative mindset around what we eat is related to what we think. And I just wondered whether you had a comment.
Absolutely. There's the problem of the problem again. Like of seeing things as a problem, but what you pointed towards for me is like this Wendell Berry quote. The problem is that we have a food system that has no idea about the health system, and we're having a health system that has no idea about the food system, or something along those lines. And even now, like where in the space of regenerative agriculture, the world has picked up quicker than in a lot of areas. And even these large incumbents are seemingly moving into that space in a way that, well, makes my fingernails roll up a little bit. But this understanding that we need a new food system is now everywhere. And there are 101 UNDP, you name it. Like I've been invited to some, even like some Thich Nhat Hanh inspired consultants running a kind of conscious food systems lab inside the UNDP. Lots of interesting conversations going on. And we're still looking at the food system, and we're looking at the water system, and we're looking at the energy system, and we're looking at the health system. And we very rarely look at the observer. We rarely look at the narrative that informs all of that. And all of them are connected. And then when you try to bring that into the room, people kind of go, oh, that was a really inspiring talk, and that was really interesting, but let's get practical now. So where were we with our food systems thing? We need to get this stuff done by 2024, because then we run out of funding. And then they publish a report and nobody reads the report. And they've wasted so many wonderful people's time who actually try to make a difference. And how do we overcome that? How do we make a food? Like, I think that food, and one of my, like, if you haven't seen her work, if you're working in agriculture, the work of Helena Norberg Hodge and the International Society for Ecology and Culture, and even her wonderful, by now quite old book, Ancient Futures, it's really, like, she, when I studied at Schumacher College in 2001, she was the one that actively, locally campaigned for a local food economy and a relationship of people with their place through the food they were eating. And then the big Tesco's and so on started putting food miles on the stickers and stuff, but she really got that conversation going. And this entry point of food to place, to water, to watershed, to our health, to the fact that we are a walking ecosystem with more non-human cells than human cells, that your gut and my gut are full of an ecosystem without which we wouldn't have health, and which critically depends on what food we put inside of us in terms of what ecosystems we have. And this is, again, like, in like having you on the call, like the Asian cultures knew always that you need to eat kimchi and those things to get the microorganisms to build health. We need to bring those kind of deeply lived participatory engagement with place into modern culture. How do you make kimchi and do Zoom calls and grow a food forest and still make a living for your family? That's new ways of living together. And the left-right hemisphere conversation is powerful and has helped a lot of people, and even helped some sort of social healing of different ways of seeing. And there's a danger, like, as far as I know, that there's a huge plasticity in the brain in its even late stage evolution after trauma, to be able to cross over, reconnect, take over functions of the left to the right, and vice versa. So why do we need yet another strong dualism to help us evolve our thinking? I think that it's when we frame things too much in these dualisms, we begin to sell old wine in new wineskins.
I wanted to thank you for offering the warning about McGilchrist's work, that it can be so readily misunderstood by the left hemisphere. But I'm a deep fan of his work, because he is at such great lengths to explain that left and right are to be understood symbolically, not in any way as a duality that is based in a binary duality or reality that is split. Rather, he's at pains to say that reality is always unified, and that we have two ways, at least two ways at the very basic level of understanding the world. So there are two narratives, and these two narratives, they stand in a dialogue with each other. And we have been, and what we call Western culture is a good description, because there's a group of Homo sapiens that is subject to an, if you want, cultural or epigenetic narrative that overemphasizes the impact of what he describes as the left hemisphere thinking. That doesn't mean that that is my or your left hemisphere. And it doesn't mean that it can't also be compensated for in the right hemisphere. It is simply an asymmetrical way in which the human sense-making apparatus operates, much like there's asymmetry in all of the relationships that you've outlined from the cell through to the biosphere. There is, and this asymmetry is what creates the perpetual motion. That is what is the narrative motion, and that is the important, I think, of his work, is not that there is a duality, but that there is an asymmetry, and the asymmetry is part of what either leads to a misconception of the world as a duality, or to one that allows us to get the inkling of the unity of things, which I think is the very fine line we're approaching here in thinking. And I just want to, the reason why I'm being so pedantic about what McGilchrist is saying is because it's very easy with your notion of becoming indigenous to fall for the idea that there is another story told by another people somewhere that we can adopt, and then wholeness will follow. So if we turn east, or that's not what you're saying.
No.
I'm saying that the left brain interpretation of what you're saying could very quickly be, there is a better way, a different way, which is essentially what you're talking about when you talk about the danger of codifying regeneration in all sorts of contexts, is that it immediately, so this, rather, and so this is the point I'm trying to get to. What McGilchrist's whole asymmetry is about is that the agency for the recognition of the world's unity is vested in each individual. We have what we need in order to have the experience of the field, but it is the left brain idea that creates a glass ceiling at the level of systems thinking, because we codify knowledge in this very abstract way that we remove from that our personal capacity to stand literally in the field and develop our senses to the extent that our scale of things allows for, which is that the unity of things flows through us and is influenced reciprocally through how we imprint on nature and nature imprints on us, which is essentially what you were talking about with your oak tree experience.
That is fascinating. First of all, just briefly as a meta comment, I called up this completely oversimplified left brain, right brain thing because I've been annoyed by how many people refer to it and build entire chiringuitos like trainings and conversations to train people around a very, very shallow, not even understanding of McGilchrist's work that you've just described beautifully, but a kind of another dualism. And it's a similar way that I find with a lot of people that have done deep work in the regenerative world, to see, like, there's a beautiful conversation I had with Tyson Yunkaporta on the other podcast, where we sort of reflect both of how, as an author, for example, you have to let go of others completely bastardizing what you've said and using it in a completely different way. And what I think what you were beautifully summarizing there in McGilchrist's work is what William Blake was referring to when he said, "May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." It's not understanding that as powerful as this way of seeing is, there are other ways of participating. And Bothoft said exactly the same thing, but he calls it that he speaks of two different ways of consciousness that are both informative but mutually exclusive in the present moment when you're engaging in the whole. You can it's like a Kuhnian Gestalt switch. You either see the world that way or you see it that way, but you can't see both cubes at the same time.
It is a real privilege to take the time to talk in this intellectually stimulating way, as you put it. But I think there's more at work than it just being a privilege. I think it is a little bit like gardening, and one has to choose one's time, and one can't always garden, one can't always have intellectual conversation. But where it goes beyond the privilege is in the ways we think and in the stories we tell quite unwittingly, what we think about ourselves and what our role in the world might be. And the exercise of that muscle, it is through words that we recognize the capacity to tell our own story. And when that is not kindled, when people who haven't thought about it in the way like you don't go out there and don't share that capacity to think for yourself, people do go to sleep, or the reverse, they don't wake up. And it is so unless you sow the seeds, there will not be a harvest. And by that I don't mean that you put what you think is the seed in there. You know, you're obviously, it is what needs kindling is that the agency is at the individual level, not at the institutional level. This won't be solved through any form of codified knowledge or program. It will be because if there will be a change, it's through individuals connecting through the place right under their feet. So I just wanted to say that there's that privilege and the possibility of a different world through conversation, and that I've really enjoyed so many ways in which you've stimulated me beyond the intellect. And I've really felt this deeply in me. It's been very, very inspirational, and not least because I recognize very clearly that I think to a certain extent I've actually done enough talking in my life just to be paradoxical.